So can we just advance to make sure that the next slide comes up? Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. Well, welcome everybody. I'm sorry about that delay at the beginning, so we'll have to make up a little time. I just wanted to give you a real overview of some of the basics of human development, as well as how does trauma fit into it, and what can we do to work with parents to help move things forward. So again, because this is a CME, I need to let you know that I have no disclosures. And just to start out, that human beings are complex, our understanding is evolving, and we're social, we're interconnected, and we can't be reduced to our parts, even though I will be showing you pieces and parts as well as showing you models, which are useful, but they're limited. So again, when we think about human beings, we're far, far more complex than what I'm able to share with you today, and we're still learning. So next slide, please, Jen. So I think one of the pieces that really has moved things forward was in the year 2000, there was a report by the Neurons to Neighborhoods. Jack Shonkoff, who's now at the Center for the Developing Child at Harvard, was one of the authors. And this was a call to action. And it said that all children are born wired for feelings and ready to learn. And early environments and nurturing relationships are very critical to their well-being. And that, you know, what we needed to learn about that, about the science and the policy all needed to be directed, and that the information, the changes that are happening in our society were actually not good for young children. So this was a real call for action. And so for the slide that's up, it gives you a sense that children live in the context of relationships. And this picture we have with the three circles of the child, we lost, oh, there it is. Community and society. You've seen this in some of the work we saw this morning. And this work comes from Yuri Boffenbrenner, who was a sociologist who helped us understand that kids come in the context of not only their families, but their community and society. So the next slide, please. And again, as we keep learning and we keep our understanding of children, we really understand that the ecology or the environment that they live in, both the physical and social environment, becomes biology, and altogether that drives development. So while this is a complicated picture, really what it's saying is that the environment, biology, and development are all intertwined. Next slide, please. Oh, this is a funny slide. So Jen, if you wouldn't mind advancing just a couple of, giving just a couple of pushes, it's one of those multiple type things. So let me just share with you what the arrows are. So the idea here is that we're really trying to create healthy developmental trajectories, first line. And underneath it are the green arrows, which are supportive relationships, and healthy environment. So this is really our hope work on the bottom. What we've come to understand is that the red arrows on the top are the significant adversities that can happen anytime along the timeline. And what we as a community and what we as a team need to really do is look at how do we put that bright red group of new protective interventions into place. So to do that, next slide, please. We really need to understand what children need in child development. We'll talk a little bit about temperament, the polyvagal theory, and social engagement, as well as attachment and the importance of self-regulation and co-regulation. These are things that we want to happen during development. So next slide, please. So when you start thinking about what do babies need, I have some pictures in here. So the first one is we need a loving caregiver. We need healthy food. I have a doctor taking care of patients. Of course, as a pediatrician, I am a little bit biased. On the picture with the two, we need our friends. We need someone who can teach us. And that last little boy is in a toxic tub. So we need to have environments that are not toxic and safe. Next slide, please. And so my whole interest in the work that we do is to really enhance and promote nurture. And nurture is simply defined as or to encourage the growth and development of. And for me, it's about children. For others, it can be about plants, it can be about pets, but nurture is something that we're really wired for. And ideally, for any child, we want parents and caregivers who are available, attuned, and interested what children need to help them grow. So next slide. And I really think of, on the slide right before, I think of nurture as the active form of love. And I think we can see in this slide that nurturing relationships build better brains, healthy attachment, social emotional intelligence, self-regulation, and resiliency. And I just want to pause for a second to talk about resiliency. We hear a lot about the term resiliency, particularly in the context of the work around ACEs and how important having resiliency is. But what we really want people to understand is the idea of resiliency is always in the context of relationships. We become more resilient when we have people who are there to support us. If you think about it for yourself, think about those people in your life who supported you and how they've helped you build your resiliency. And we really think the key step is regulation and co-regulation. So we'll be talking about that throughout today's presentation, about the importance of regulation and how that looks. So next slide, please. Oh, I can't resist this picture. And again, nurture is inborn from my perspective. So you can see these two little twins in a NICU isolette, and I just don't know what else to say, but it really is inborn. So next slide. So before we jump into all of this, I just wanted to kind of throw up here a definition of the mind, because again, really what we're trying to do is create healthy minds. And Dan Siegel, who is an expert who's a pediatrician and a child psychiatrist up in LA, got together a group of really big thinkers. They spent a couple of years trying to define what the mind is. And even with that, they had to hedge their bets. They said the mind, in part, is an embodied relational process that regulates the flow of energy and information. And two aspects of the regulation process are monitoring and modifying. It's very interesting. We can go into psychiatry, we can go into pediatrics, we can go into all the different fields all of us are in. And we talk about the mind, but nobody really tries to define what it is. So this is the best attempt of some of our biggest thinkers to think about that. And so if you think about it, is monitoring and modifying is really attuning and regulating. And so that's, again, an important aspect of what we're trying to do is help create healthy minds. And in the next slide, we see that the mind really has three sets of inputs. We have it from the brain, the heart, and the body. Today, I'll be using a lot of images from the brain, but I also want you to think about our body gives us a lot of information and sensations. Our heart gives us information as well. Both our gut, our digestive system has half as many neurons as our brain, and our heart actually is very rich in neurons as well. So the oligodendrites that Bob Segi talked about this morning in the brain, but again, the neurons are all throughout the body. And again, how our minds work and how we work really also depends on our physical state. So our mind is going to work differently if we're tired, if we're sleepy, if we're hungry, and if we're thirsty. So as we think about this, you'll see a little image that I'm going to show you next of the interrelationship between our brains, our heart, and our body. So Jen, next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry, that's coming up in a little bit. This is a slide that I almost always use in every talk. And again, it's a really important slide because what this is talking about, the critical periods of development. And the reason I put this up there, and it might be a little bit hard to read, but what I really want to point out is the second one down is emotional control. If you see the way our emotional control starts to develop is even before the end of the first year of life. So between about 10 months and 3 years is when we're starting to really figure out how our emotional control works. But the part that's really staggering is habitual ways of responding. Again, before 3, this is getting hardwired in. This is starting to happen over 1.
Enter your meeting ID followed by...
Oh, okay. So again, I want you just to see this, just to kind of get in your mind how important early is in child development. Next slide, please. Oops, can we go back one to that brain?
Sorry, yes, 1 second. I need to.
That's okay.
Let me see.
I know I'm making it a little harder for you.
Yeah, unfortunately, when I'm sharing, I'm going to have to reshare. Sorry, 1 second.
No, don't worry then. Oh,
That's okay. It's because it fills up my full screen,
okay.
so I can't see anything other than that. Let me get to the right. So, my apologies.
No worries.
Here?
Okay, right, yeah. Right.
I don't want to do it. Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
You can use the backspace key, Jim. Backspace key.
Thank you.
There we go. So in this slide, what I want you to see is what I call the 5 different areas of development in our brain. So if we go to the bottom, we see the survival state. That's the brain stem. And that really is around the question of, am I safe? And so that's the sensation. So again, as I showed earlier, our mind is getting input from our sensations. So that's the survival part. If we go up one more, we go to the emotional state, and that's the limbic system. And that's really asking, am I loved? And that's emotions. Then the executive state, or the prefrontal lobes, you see the question is, what can I learn from this? So those are your thoughts. So that box of thoughts, emotions, and sensations you're going to see in the next box. But before we go there, the other part that's really interesting is outside of ourselves is the aspect of development around our social development. And our social development really is our connection to others. And the question there is who are my family and who are my friends? Essentially, who are my people? Then there's this 5th developmental area that I consider important, which is our interrelationship, our pro-social development. It's feeling the needs of others. And then the question that comes up is, who can I help and how can I make this world a better place? So again, all of you who are here and all of you who are part of this community really have developed this aspect. And I consider this the highest part of our own evolution as human beings, is this ability to consider the needs of others and that desire to help. So we will be focusing more on those 3 areas that are represented in the picture of the brain as we go through this. But again, our social development and our pro-social development are also very important aspects of our lives. So next slide, please, Jeff. So again, what I'm trying to represent here is in the circle, which is the body, we have thoughts, emotions, and sensations. And it's interesting because a sensation can trigger a thought or an emotion can trigger a thought or a sensation. Likewise, if you think about something, it can also trigger emotions and sensations. So this is what's happening inside of us all the time. And so this is kind of that idea of what is our inner world. Now, the interesting part is in the next slide, you're going to see what happens when there's 2 worlds. In the inner world of 2, this becomes important as we talk about regulation and co-regulation. You can see that with a parent and a child, the child has thoughts and sensations as well, and emotions, and there's a communication that happens. Even though things are happening within ourselves, there is a communication that's happening in that social dimension where you can almost feel, particularly with a parent and a child, you can almost feel the thoughts and emotions of a parent being transmitted. This morning when we were talking about teenagers who say, you know, they don't want to burden their parents, again, it's an interesting piece because they can feel their parents' stress and they don't want to burden. So it's really interesting, these nonverbal communication. That's, again, about 70% of our communication. So next slide. And in this one, what I really want you to see is the world of a parent and a baby, right? So babies have emotion and sensation, but their thoughts aren't there yet. So again, that's why babies are so impressionable. And as they're learning and growing and developing thought, the important part of making sure that parents are well regulated, parents are feeling strong and feeling healthy. So next slide. And one of the things that happens in this time when babies are little is babies come into the world with what's known as temperament, the biological response to environments. One of my heroes and one of the people that motivated me to become a pediatrician, Barry Brazelton, talked about easy babies and fussy babies and how that will have an impact on their parents and the relationship between the parents. Now, he was talking about this back in 1969. So before there was a lot of research and before there was all this brain science, he would observe. And he was such a great teacher and a great understanding person who really understood parents and what challenges they might face. Later on, Jerome Kagan really helped us understand temperament and really put together these 9 areas of temperament. And temperament really, again, coming back to it, is the idea of we're all born with an innate biology that is how we relate to the world. And so these categories of activity level, persistence, distractibility, initial reaction, adaptability, mood intensity, sensitivity, regularity, and sensory threshold are kind of biologically wired. Now, depending on how you interact with the world and how the world interacts with you, there is some malleability, some ability for this to change, but it's fairly fixed when we're early in our lives. So what's important about this? Well, in Healthy Development Services, one of the projects that I'm on, we really have had a very interesting time educating parents about temperament. It's led to a lot of aha moments for parents, because sometimes when your temperament is matched with a person, sometimes that's great. It makes it easy. Sometimes when you have a temperament match, it can be a problem. So think about mood intensity. If everybody gets really amped up, that could be a challenge. Likewise, when there's a temperamental mismatch, that can also be a challenge. There have been times where we've had parents who are very kind of mellow and quieter, and then they have a child that's very intense, and they're like, oh my God, there's something wrong with my child. But we really go through and we help them look at their child's temperament and help them understand that they're different and they go through the world differently. So this whole sense of how we innately go through the world and what's biologic versus what is learned is really important. So on the next slide, we start getting into how this work advanced. So this is Stephen Porges's work. Stephen Porges is a psychologist and also a neurobiologist. What Stephen Porges adds to our work is he helps start to give more explanation and a deeper explanation to temperament through being able to show that the vagus nerve had more to it than what I learned in my classical training in biology. So what does that mean? Well, the vagus nerve goes through the entire body. It hits all of these different organs, but it connects to the brainstem. And it gives information about the body. So Porges coined this term called neuroception, which is the feeling of our body. And so on the next slide, you'll see how he looked at the different aspects. So if you look at the number 3 and number 1 on this, you'll see what's considered the myelinated. This is the part that he added, which actually looks at the social communication, soothing, and calming. What's interesting is that the vagus nerve goes through the body, but it connects to these other nerves in the head called the cranial nerves. And it was Porges that really looked at this and helped us understand that the way that we regulate, there's a biological way that we're communicating. What I learned in med school is that lower number, the unmyelinated vagus nerve, which really is that classic piece that we'll be talking about in stress biology about the fight or flight response and kind of keeping us alive. So Porges's work is really, really important in helping us understand that the vagus nerve not only helps us fight and flight, but it actually helps us with relating to one another. In the next slide, you'll see what I consider even more important than his polyvagal theory is the social engagement system work that he did. And this is the system that really helps us regulate with the external world, and it modulates both our physiologic and behavioral states. That's why these 2 aspects of the vagus nerve are so important. So for an infant, vagal regulation is associated with social behavior, ingestion, and state regulation. So all these fancy terms come back to one of the things that helps soothe the baby is feeding. Well, that's true if the child has a regular nervous system. Some babies, again, coming back to their temperament, their nervous system is not going to be soothed by the effects of feeding. And that's those kids that Brazelton talked about that were fussy. And again, pediatricians could see this pattern of fussy babies, but it's really Porges and Porges's work that allows us to actually see how this is actually happening on a biologic basis. So again, fascinating on the biology. So I've spent a lot of time on the biology. I get a little excited about it. It's very interesting to me. Next slide. We can see what are the elements of this social engagement system. So it's voice prosody. It's the tone of the voice. It's how we look at the gaze, our facial expressions, our posture during social engagement, our mood, our state regulation. This is all these nonverbal cues. And if you notice with moms, they will instinctively hold the baby on the left side of their body, where their heart is. And it's really fascinating because, again, the mirroring of the mother and the baby, it's just fascinating to see how that all works together. So these are just these important aspects of biology that are at play as we start talking about the other pieces that we'll be talking about with the effects of trauma. So Jen, next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about attachment. The next 3 slides are about attachment, but I'll talk about it relatively quickly. Tomorrow, we're going to have a great session in the afternoon with Ruth Newton and Chris Walsh, both of who are experts in the area of attachment. And attachment basically is something that we hope happens early in childhood, where John Bowlby recognized these patterns of attachment. And again, attachment is developed as a baby has needs and how those needs are met. So if a baby starts to cry and has a need and that need is met, they start feeling a secure attachment to their primary caregiver. And so the parent is there and there's that secure feeling. When the parent isn't there, there's 2 different patterns that evolve, an ambivalent style or an avoidance style. And so what ends up happening is the child seeks attention, and with the ambivalent style, they actually kind of end up being a little bit anxious and they really kind of cling and hold on. The avoidant child actually ends up kind of being a little bit aloof because they don't want their feelings hurt. So these patterns of attachment develop. Now, why is that important? On the next slide, you'll see kids learn by exploring. And so there's a safe base that's created when they know that there's somebody there who's going to. So just think about children and little ones. You see, when they have a secure base, they'll go off and explore, and they'll look back to the parent to make sure that the parent is there. And then if they're distressed, then they'll call the parent, and the parent will respond. So again, when there's a secure attachment, you get this sense of a child who's willing to go explore the world, but comes back and knows that they're safe when they're scared or when things are overwhelming for them. And what happens in that is shown in the next slide of really creating a secure base. In this model of the secure base model, that they know the parent is available. They know that the parent is there and is accepting and is cooperating, is sensitive to them, and gives a sense of belonging. So again, attachment is such a critically important aspect of what happens for children in normal development. So we're going to move from attachment to the next slide to understanding that these pieces of a parent that responds to the child's temperament, responds to the child's needs, to create trust. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because, as we're going to see when we start talking about trauma, is trust gets disrupted. And so our work is to restore that trust and restore the relationships, which happens through both attachment and treatment. Next slide, please, Jen. So part of attuning is being able to regulate. So self-regulation allows kids to manage their emotions and their behavior and their body movements when they're faced with a difficult situation. And do that while staying focused and paying attention. I think today with all of our devices and stuff, we all can practice our self-regulation skills. Next slide, please. And if you think about the metaphor of a car, really how the car works together, there's an engine, there's an accelerator, there's brakes, there's a gas tank, there's a speedometer, there's gauges, and there's tires. So if you think about how all of those things work together, that's how we are, right? We have an accelerator, we have brakes, and we use that. But we also need to consider things outside of ourselves, like the road, the weather conditions. And so what's fascinating is this piece of cars and engines and how your engine runs. You can help children as young as 3 really understand how they're feeling and what's going on. This is an aspect of teaching that I think we need to do. Same with emotions. It's really important to help kids get the language of what's going on inside of them. Next slide, please. And self-regulation does. It depends on our level of, it's really taking information in from our environment that's useful and tuning out what's not useful. It depends on our level of stress and arousal, and it's really critical for self-control and our ability to form relationships with others. In fact, when you look at lifelong success, self-regulation is one element that is the key element that always jumps out. Next, please. So Alan Shore up in LA is a researcher in this area of self-regulation and affect regulation. And he sees this transfer of regulation from external, of relying on others, to internal. The ability to self-regulation is a key task of early development. I myself see it as a lifelong skill. I think teenagers all have this incredible experience of brain growth. And what they really do need is some co-regulation during that time period. I also think all of us who take care of others can feel stressed and sometimes need external regulation as well. So again, I personally think this is a lifelong skill. Next slide, please. And here, I just want you to see that, again, what ends up happening, we'll be talking about this in the stress biology, is we learn best when we're calm, alert, and present. But when we get aroused, we can either get hyper alert and flooded, kind of overwhelmed, or we can become hypo alert, drowsy, and asleep. Stress can either ramp us up or wind us down. And that's important because in the next slide, we see that babies need co-regulation. And so on the next slide, we'll see all of the reasons why babies need that. Babies can't regulate themselves. And again, that massive brain growth occurs in critical areas to self-regulation in the early years. And that's why having someone there, a primary caregiver who's your external brain, who regulates and stimulates you, is so important. And by being externally regulated, the baby then develops the ability to self-regulate. So again, the next couple of slides show that. So next slide, please. Is parents really are teaching kids how to self-regulate. Next slide. And when we're distressed, we all need someone to respond to us. Now you're going to see this slide a couple times through the show because it is a really critical element to, again, building resiliency. We need people there to help us regulate when we're distressed. And when we're little, we're learning it. I love these pictures because you have the feeling that you can get where you see that first one where the father's with his child, soothing. You can see that little girl is the only one that I have who's by herself, but she's obviously well attached because look, her arms are up reaching out for someone to care for her. And again, I have little ones on the top, but you can see the two mothers with their toddlers and helping them soothe and regulate. And then the next picture, or the next slide, sorry. Just stop for a second and take a look at this mom. Just get a feeling for that picture of the mom with that baby. There's a sensation that happens of pleasure. So there's a distressed child. The mother picks up the distressed child, calms the child. Now, the interesting part is, as a parent, when you're calming the child, you actually have a hormonal cascade that happens. That, again, oxytocin is released in this time period. And Bob was talking about this morning how some researchers looking at the importance of oxytocin release as it relates to relationships. You see where we are here, and that cascade creates a calm. So just take a second for all of you to think about that for yourselves and think about times where you have had that experience, where you have felt when you've soothed a child or helped a friend that there's a cascade of calm that happens for you. So, okay, and then we'll go to the next slide. And we're going to start talking about trauma. So, Jeff, I guess one of the things I'm worried about is our time. We've got about 50 minutes, and I've still got a ton of slides. So, I'm going to try to move quickly, but do we have any questions that have come up so far?
No questions so far, but don't go quickly. Take your time because each piece builds on the other piece. So
you mean we'll be here till 6? Okay. So next slide, Jen. Okay, so when we think about trauma, just the basic definition, trauma is the result of an overwhelming amount of stress that exceeds one's ability to cope or integrate the emotions involved with that experience. The piece about trauma that makes it so interesting to work with is trauma differs between individuals according to their subjective experience. So two of us could go through the same experience, but we can have a very, very different response to trauma. And in the next slide, we'll see why childhood trauma, so next slide, please. Childhood is different. Childhood trauma is different because, again, the physical and emotional response to the events that threaten the life or the integrity of the child or someone critically important to the child. So this is the important distinction. We see now in research that domestic violence, even though the child isn't the target of it, can have such a profound effect if the father who's the victim of the domestic violence, it impacts the child. And these traumatic events overwhelm the child's capacity to cope and elicit feelings of terror, powerlessness, and out of control physiological arousal. We're going to go through stress biology, and you're going to see how this actually ends up disrupting their overall development. So failure to provide a sensitive and mutually confirming interaction during developmentally important periods of life also really important in terms of trauma. So let's stop for a second and just talk about this piece with children. If you have a traumatic event as a child and there's no one there to help you make sense of it, that's what is so difficult. We have fires that just happened in East County. And, you know, I saw an interview with a dad who was with his two little girls and they had lost their house. Now, if he can help them understand and make sense of that experience, it's very different. And if he can work with their fears and help them to understand, that's a very different experience than a child trying to explain it by themselves with their limited abilities at that time. Next slide, please. And this is what's really interesting about children, right? They have a degree of vulnerability. They have an immature alert and alarm system. So they're still developing that. The other part is they're dependent on their caregivers for support and context. So lack of the physical ability to shield themselves, the lack of emotional resources, the lack of the ability to discriminate what's a threat and what is just a new and novel experience. And the other part that's really hard is sometimes children have to stay with the caregiver even when the caregiver is the source of the trauma or arousal. Next slide, please. So if we were in person, I would ask how many of you have heard about the ACEs. Bob talked about it really quick this morning. But again, the ACEs is a really important study that helped us really see the connection between early childhood events and later health outcomes. Vincent Felitti here in San Diego at Kaiser did this incredible study, looked at it, and really put a link to the number of adverse childhood experiences and the health risk behaviors and outcomes later on in life. And so again, we're going to try to explain why that's happening through this stress biology. Next slide, please. So again, with stress, I don't want to make stress to be this big bad thing, because on the green you see what Sales called eustress, which is positive stressors. So think about it like when you're learning to drive a car, there's a degree of stress that we have. It's a challenge and it activates us and it actually helps us develop and grow. So the right amount of stress is actually helpful. And there's a great book out called The Upside of Stress by Kelly McGonigal, and she really did some great work to help people understand how stress can be a positive thing. And if we see it as a positive thing, then it actually can be helpful and you can actually improve your outcome. That said, we're talking about negative stress and danger, insurmountable barriers, where the fight and flight response is activated in chronic stress. So as we go through, we'll be talking a little bit more about that as we go. So next slide, please. So currently, we talk about, again, what I talked about is positive stress, and then tolerable stress was the example around the fire. It's temporary. If someone's there to help explain it, you can grow from that experience and your system can reset. However, with toxic stress, we have this prolonged stress that you can see where the stress level stays elevated and you don't get a chance to recover. Next slide, please. So again, I told you you'd see this one again. When we're stressed, we all need someone to respond to us. Next slide. Unfortunately, sometimes that person is the stressor. Next slide. So when we perceive a threat, it can be from environmental stressor, work home, and this is where that pair of aces, where the tree that we saw earlier in the presentations, and Wendy Ellis's work is really talking about stresses in the environment. You can have major life events and then trauma and abuse. You can see that there's individual differences, and how we perceive the stress gives us a behavior response that actually has an impact on our physiology. And our body is always trying to come back to equilibrium. It's always trying to keep us in a stable state. The next slide, please. And what we see are these patterns with stress, right? So the stress occurs, and you see on the bottom the 3 different ways that we respond. You can have stress and you can freeze. So again, we hear about the fight or flight response, which is in the middle. But another thing that happens is we can be overwhelmed and we can freeze. And the idea behind freezing is, again, as an evolutionary step, is that if you don't look like a threat or you don't look like you're alive, sometimes the person who's pursuing you would that's the freeze. Oh, are you okay out there?
Yes.
And then there's the fight or flight response. And then again, remember how I showed the picture and the oxytocin and the affiliation. So again, these are the ways that stress works. We can have fight or flight, freeze, or when we're comforted by someone, affiliation. Next slide, please. So while this slide looks very busy, what I really want you to look at is that on the left-hand side of the slide where it's blue, it's the acute stress. On the left-hand side is the blue. On the right-hand side is the red, where you have acute stress versus chronic stress. But you can see that we're always trying to come back to that middle. We're always coming back to that green. So again, going down to the bottom of this slide, you can see that acute stress that you can manage actually is protective. Our bodies are always trying to maintain our health in the middle. And the problem is chronic stress will give us adverse health outcomes. Next slide, please. And again, I keep coming back to relationships are needed to build resiliency. And you can see that resiliency happens when stress is moderate, predictable, and controlled. And we become vulnerable when the stress is unpredictable, severe, and prolonged. And that just makes sense. Next slide. So we're going to talk about the biologic effects. So changes in the brain, changes in the hormones, changes in the immune system, and the behavioral effects that children under stress will show. Next slide. Oh, sorry, Jen. This is one of those funny ones. Go ahead and hit the arrow a few times because these little neurons are going to come up, and we're going to show that under chronic stress, there's less neurons, there's less connections between the neurons. And if you keep going a few more, this is where I wish I was getting to drive. Next, one more. Yeah, thank you. You can see that there's actually more connections when there's less stress. So in the prefrontal and hippocampus areas of the brain, chronic stress actually reduces the neuronal connections, which is quite alarming. Next slide, please. And we'll show you in the next slides how that plays out. So the long-term changes in the brain can affect mood and attachment. That's changes in serotonin and GABA receptors. It can be changes in memory, learning difficulties in the hippocampus. And it can increase risk and pleasure-seeking behaviors, changes in the nucleus accumbens, the reward center in the brain. So again, that's what chronic stress can do. Next slide, please. And in a study in 2009, Tomato showed that in a case control with a non-clinical sample, harsh corporal punishment was associated with a reduction in gray matter volume in the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the part of our brain that actually helps us put on the brakes and helps us decide. It's kind of the decision-making part of our brain. So you can imagine if you grow up with harsh corporal punishment, your ability to regulate yourself later on in life is affected. So again, if you think about many of our families that we take care of, the parents grew up and that was the experience. They had harsh physical punishment. So again, helping them understand how that impacted them then allows you to talk with them about how they can relate differently to their children. Next slide, please. So changes in the hormonal system. So again, the fight or flight response, if you keep hitting that buzzer, it's going to take an effect. And the subsequent response to stressors, you might see some hyperarousability, some irritability, or you might see the opposite, a loss of feedback. And so here you see the different organs that we're talking about in the hormonal system. So everything from the pituitary to the thyroid, to the pancreas, to the liver, to our to the ovaries in women and testes in males. But again, you see the placenta. So again, stress in pregnancy can have a really significant impact both on the mother and the baby. And in the next slide, please, you can see where this will show up symptoms-wise. Now there's a lot of different things, but basically what we're going through is showing that when there's hormonal dysregulation, you can have heartburn, heart attacks, high blood sugar, sexual dysfunction. All of these different things are impacted through our hormonal system. Next slide, please. And this one, I don't want you to get overwhelmed by this one. It's just, again, kind of showing you how inflammation is impacted by chronic stress. So in these in each one of these patterns, you see the lower one is when there's no child maltreatment. The middle is probable maltreatment, and then the one that's higher is the definite, like when there's definite child abuse, okay? So if you look at it, all four of these, from fibrinogen to C-reactive protein to white blood cells to inflammation factor, these are all parts of showing that the immune system gets revved up by this. So what happens when your immune system is chronically revved up? It gets fatigued. You're more likely to get sick. And the other part is with revved up inflammation, we also understand that inflammation has a significant impact on health throughout the entire body, and is really linked to chronic illness. So next slide, please. Now we start seeing how the things that we see in early childhood can show up in children's behavior. So ACEs and social emotional developmental concerns, Blodgett in 2012 looked at a group of Head Start children. 60% had violent exposures. They had a mean ACE score of over 3. Their parents had a mean ACE score of over 5. 2/3 of the children with positive ACE screenings had one report or more of social emotional developmental concerns reported both by the parent and the teacher using the Devereux Early Childhood Assessment. So again, we can see that there's a link between behavioral issues and exposures to ACEs. Nadine Burke-Harris, our Surgeon General in California, actually has a wonderful paper, which I couldn't get the slide of. But again, it shows that kids in her clinic, which was a low-income clinic, when they had no ACEs, had no behavioral problems reported in preschool. So again, this piece of getting to the ACEs and preventing and treating them early and the lifelong impact is incredibly important. Next slide. So here's some more research that just goes to show that the connection. So Kimony in 2009 showed that a disruption in the hormonal system, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, promoted inflammation that contributed to heart disease and a propensity towards depression and aggression. Davis et al. In 2007 showed that kindergarteners exposed to chronic parental conflict showed decreased cortisol reactivity, and it predicted more externalizing behaviors 2 years later. And then in 2009, Choi et al. Showed that parent verbal abuse, even absent of other forms of abuse, affected the brain white matter in areas that affected verbal IQ, depression, and anxiety. So again, this is again showing how important it is to work with parents. Next slide, please. So just to sum up the effects of early childhood trauma can affect us at the level of attachment, physical, you can see problems with movement and sensation, emotional regulation, behavior control, and you also see it in development and cognition. So in attention, learning difficulties, regression of milestones, and you can have specific domains or global delays. And in the next slide, please, we will see where that shows up in the brain. And so it's a slightly busy picture, but basically what I'm trying to show here in this one is the pieces that we talked about. These are the different areas of the brain that are affected. So again, the brain changes are so important for a child's lifelong ability. So this early trauma can have effects that last a lifetime. Next slide, please. So Jeff, do you want to talk about these? Because these are your slides.
No, I love the way you're kind of folding things in together. You're really weaving it together in a very gentle way. So, nope.
Okay. All right. Always trying to get Jeff involved. So I am going to give credit to Jeff. This was something that he and I have been talking about for years, and he shared with me this piece of how we understood mental health in the past. So there was, the genetic or heritable vulnerabilities. There's things that happen early in life, like birth trauma, physical malformations, congenital pieces. There's learned maladaptive behaviors. There's psychological conflict. There's social relation problems. There's caregiver-child relationships. So again, that piece of attachment and loss and temperamental mismatch was there. Medical problems, and then physical trauma. Next slide. But we have to add two more. So there's the psychological trauma, which is from physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, or neglect, and interruptions in development. And on the next slide, please, you'll see what those interruptions in development are. So again, just want to give credit to Jeff for conceptualizing this and putting it out there. Is inexperienced caregivers, a lack of support for those caregivers, a lack of capacity, a loss of continuity of affection, removal from home. Again, we work with kids in the foster care system. We know that's a significant impact. Loss of a parent, a sibling, or a nanny. Problems of sensitivity in response and mutually confirming. So the inability to attune to a child. And challenges that are not overcome early. So sleeping, eating, speech and language, fine motor, gross motor, social development, behavioral issues. If these aren't addressed early, these can show up later. And I keep referring to Jeff, but Jeff has a session coming up where he'll go in a little bit deeper into this and his own experience as a child psychiatrist, understanding that what we sometimes gave a diagnosis to was really something that was a challenge that wasn't overcome early. And again, these things weave together. So when we see kids with behavioral problems later in life, we really have to ask, where did this start and what elements are in there? This is gonna be tough, Jen. So this is the multiple arrow one. So this is one, please do not repeat. This is from Bruce Perry. He let this to me. So if you could just advance the arrows. Yeah, why don't you just go ahead and advance all of them for a second here, and I'll try to do this with, oh shoot, I don't have the pointer. Okay, this is gonna be a tough slide for me to do this way, so I apologize, everybody. Technical difficulties. The heart of what this slide is showing us is in the first 2 months of life, if everything goes well, even in the first 2 months of life, the way that it shows up later in your ability to function at age 11 to 13 is much better than if you have a bad first 2 months of your life. So this, and again, I apologize, this is a tricky slide to do, but really what we're trying to get at is that early life is incredibly important. Now, that doesn't mean we can't make up for it later, it's just a lot more work. So this slide is really kind of showing that the first 2 months of life are so critical. Next slide, please. So in this third section, we're going to talk about genetics and epigenetics. And then we're going to, in the last third of the piece, really talk about how do we work with parents. So next slide. So again, just to look at what we just to summarize the last section, early life adversity, where we can have protective factors or predisposed vulnerabilities have an effect on our neurology, our brain development, our endocrine, and our immune systems. Okay, so those three pieces then have clinical implications in epigenetics. So the next slide. So early on, we got really excited about DNA, the slide that came right before this one. And there's this whole thing about DNA was going to revolutionize how we did medicine and all that. But what's more important is to see how our experiences impact our brain development, and those experiences actually change the expression of the genes. So, and that has an effect on behavior, and then behavior has an effect on experience. So you can see these loops of what are happening are all intertwined. So the next slide, please. Oops, that's the DNA one. So with DNA, if you look at DNA, right, we got all excited about DNA. Oh, this is going to change everything. but DNA really creates protein. And so what becomes important is on our next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. The other part is that our environment actually affects the expression of those genes. So we're excited about genes, but then we realize that the environment affects the expression of the gene. And so on the next slide, you'll see a slightly busy picture, but basically what I want to convey in this one is, in the old days, we used to think that DNA just had RNA that then produced proteins that had effects in our body. With epigenetics, what we found is that the body is more sophisticated. So again, based on exposure, our genes are either turned on or turned off, so meaning that they're expressed or not expressed. And that has an impact on the proteins that are built. So actually proteins are the key here to what is going on in our biology. Next slide, please. So we're gonna spend a little time on the high-lick and low-lick mice. So I always like to say human beings, we're pretty funny people. We come up with these different models with mice, and we do very strange things to them to learn. So there is a type of mouse that has the mothers display two types of behavior. One set of mothers are called low-lick mothers, and the other one are high-lick mothers. So again, the idea is that the high-lick mothers are more nurturing to the child, right? So what happens in those high-lick mothers is the babies tend to be a little bit more mellow. So in this experiment, what they did was they took the baby of a mom who was a low-lick mom, and they took those babies and they gave those babies to a mom that's a high-lick mom. So now this baby grows up in a different environment. This baby gets all of these extra licks and ends up being a less stressed out adult. The interesting part is the pup then has babies of its own, and those babies actually are now the more mellow high-lick pups or mice. So their kids end up having that low stress profile. So they really wanted to study what happened. So they really went into the genes, and it activated a particular gene, and that gene actually increased a protein inside a cell, and that protein actually binds to cortisol, the stress hormone, and that's what led these pups to be less stressed. And there's actually changes in their brains, in their hippocampus. So it's pretty interesting, right? That you could take the baby of one mouse, give it to a mother who had a different behavior, and then that baby growing up with that mother then replicates the behavior of the new mother. And that changes their genetic line. So that's pretty interesting that could happen. What's interesting about that is in the next slide, we actually see what's happening. And I'm sorry I don't have my little pointer, but basically the yellow steroid hormone is in the blood system. And there's this receptor that in the side of the cell that picks that off because the DNA within the cell is creating that. So again, the steroid hormone is the piece that regulates that. So, so again, the changes that you're seeing in the behavior of the mouse is happening at the intracellular level, not because of the genes, but because of the expression of the genes. So that's pretty interesting. And the other part that's interesting is you know, some people may say, well, don't you want all the mice to be, you know, what's the evolutionary benefit of having a low-lick mother because the pups are stressed out? Well, it turns out that during times of food scarcity, the low-lick pups actually survive better than the high-lick pups. They're a little bit more anxious and they're more able to go out and search for food, where the high-lick mice don't go out and search for food. So there's an evolutionary advantage depending on the environment outside. So that's why these mice developed in that different way.
Pradeep, there's a question going around in the chat box about,
Yes.
about CRISPR. Do you want to handle that, or do you want to save that for another time?
Why don't we go ahead with CRISPR?
Okay.
What's the question?
Well, the question basically is, what is CRISPR? And then a couple.
Okay. Jen, you can go to the next slide while I explain CRISPR. So CRISPR is a technology that is allowing the editing of genes. So it opens up the gene and allows parts of the gene to be taken out. Now, that's interesting in and of itself, and it could be quite revolutionary. Now, we only are just starting to understand what that could mean. So if you have a condition that's fixed and heritable, like say Huntington's disease, you could go in and modify that component of the DNA, and then that disease won't be passed on. Now, that's very interesting and important, but again, getting back into the complexity of this is what we're talking about here with the epigenetics is how genes are influenced by the environment. So that's actually going back into the DNA itself and changing it. So this technology around CRISPR is going to be quite revolutionary. It's also going to be quite controversial because we don't know the consequences of some of it. The important part to know is some genetic conditions are transmitted by the DNA. Some genetic conditions are transmitted by the expression of the DNA. And that's the epigenetics that we're talking about. And again, the important part is to think about what happens in one generation can then get passed down through the multiple generations, which is this next slide. So if a grandparent has toxins that they're exposed to, or smokes or drinks or has a poor diet, that can be passed from generation to generation. But the technology with CRISPR could actually allow us to get at some diseases that are at the DNA level. So next slide, please. So in this last section, with the last 20 minutes we have, I want to really talk about what we can do and what works. So next slide. So I really think that we need to be promoting an early brain child development agenda. So we need to promote healthy relationships, promote healthy early childhood foundations for a life course of health. That piece is really helping people understand what we do early matters throughout life. And promoting kindergarten readiness, but also lifelong success. We need to just decrease toxic stress on health and developmental trajectories, and we need to strengthen the systems and community supports to address the social determinants of health. Next slide. And the good news is brain architecture is experience dependent. So social emotional buffering makes a big difference. Positive parenting, trusted mentors, healthy attachment, social emotional skills, co-regulation and self-regulation. Next slide, please. And if we really want to make a difference, we need to focus on the adults who care for children. If we want to really have a breakthrough in the outcomes for kids, then we have to transform the lives of adults. Now, just want to stop here for a second. This is, and I don't want to get political, but this is one of the places where we run into people think, well, parents should have this. And, you know, those of us that work with parents know that every parent is trying their best. And we need to have a more gentle, more compassionate approach to changing the lives of the adults in children's lives. Next slide, please. And so again, emphasizing the importance of relationships, explaining self-regulation and co-regulation, restoring nurture and building resilience. Next slide. And you've heard me say this before, but really relationships create resiliency by developing the capacity to regulate and reflect. And we'll talk about this more deeply, but again, we really think about this as the new 3 R's, right? Relationships, regulation, reflection, resiliency. I said that's 4 R's, but you understand what I'm saying. Next slide, please. So again, self-regulation skills, we talked about that earlier. It allows adults and children to manage their emotions, their bodies, and their behavior when they're faced with challenges. It allows them to do it while still staying focused and paying attention. And that's so critical when we're attuning to kids. Next slide. So we go ahead and skip this slide. Thanks. Go to the next one. So one of the things I want to get into for the rest of the talk is kind of where we are today and the work that we're doing with healthy development services and our home visiting programs. I think we reached a place where we built a really nice system of care, and we built some really great pieces of things that really work well for families. But there were some unspoken questions that our families have. And the first one is, are you safe? Physically, emotionally, mentally, and in our relationship. The next question they have is, can you really see me? Do you know who I am? And then the next one is, can you help me? Are you useful? Like, are you competent at what you're doing? And then, will you be around for the long run and when things are tough? And then finally, the feedback we get from our families who we're trying to help is, yeah, I've heard that before. There's a lot of emotional hurt. There's betrayal, there's abandonment, there's issues that have happened to them. These questions remain unspoken. And I think what we're doing right now is working with our staff and our team to start addressing that. So the next slide, please. And I call this restoring nurture. And so nurture can only be restored in the context of respectful, reliable, responsive, and regulating relationships. And through reflection, an individual can examine his or her representation of the world and change their reality. And reflection can only happen when we feel safe and we have internal space. And with that inner strength, change is possible. Next slide, please. So this is how I think about it. And I'm not an artist, so I have to use smart art to try to represent what I'm trying to convey. So the first thing we have to do is establish safety and trust. And I say that our families sometimes come to us with the different needs that they have for their children, and they're that tight little red circle. And we might be the first person that our client feels safe with. Over time, when we convey a sense of caring and the sense of their worthiness, if you remember the conversation from this morning about worthiness, that little red dot becomes a bigger red dot. So they're still full of that hard emotion, that hurt. With the stability and support and some time, that red dot becomes a pink dot. And as trust develops, our client's inner world shifts. And so you go from that red, kind of angry, ready to fight and flight, to a blue, more calm picture. Next slide, please. And as we build trust, we need to bring benevolence. It's the degree to which the other party can take your best interest to heart and act to protect them. So you can see how benevolence is so important. Our reliability, our competence, our honesty, and our openness. When that happens, that two-dimensional blue dot, when we are there, when we support the parent, and when she starts to trust herself or himself, their world moves from a two-dimensional world to a three-dimensional world. Next slide, please. And you can see how that creates inner space and safety. And by focusing on the parent's strengths and helping them build skills, their inner space grows. That little tight red dot that I talked about, that's what a parent's world looks like. It's tight, it's small. As they start having that trust in themselves with safety and inner space, the parent can really reflect. With reflection, that parent can change the way they view the world, the representation. With safety, inner space, and inner strength, the parent can really make some meaningful change. Next slide, please. Resiliency is the ability to recover. The resiliency develops in the context of reliable, responsive, regulating relationships, and resiliency is reaching in and out for your resources. Resiliency gets you back to where you were, but hope is what gets you beyond where you were. So last year, Casey Gwynn shared so much of this great work, and Chan Hellman, who is the director of Hope Research at the University of Oklahoma, says hope is the mindset that drives resilient behavior. Next slide. And with hope for our families, we can help them think that my future can be better than right now. That sense of agency, willpower, and a pathway, way power are required. So again, that was from Casey Gwynn last year. And for our staff asking, where did you see hope today? With families and at the beginning of our team meetings, hope decreases burnout and turnover. And remember, trauma looks backward, hope looks forward. Next slide. And when we practice it, we can link it to values. So Dr. Floyd talked about common values. And so that's what I always think about is let's meet families at the common values. I want the best for you and your child. What do you value for you and your child? And how can we commit together to meet that value? So it's not about what we want, it's about what the family wants. Exploring the dreams from themselves and their kids, helping parents imagine a better future for themselves and their children. I think the thing that motivates me so much with our immigrant refugee population is to see how they think about not only their kids, but their grandkids and those dreams that they have. And the important part is setting and meeting goals creates hope and cultivating a future mindset of creating more dreams than memories. Next slide, please. And so again, hope shows parents a way forward. And so I put that in the top with the green. If we can help parents focus on optimism, hope, and extending those joyful interactions with their child, With hope, parents can be more reflective and have a greater chance to change the way they see the world. You can see that blue three-dimensional piece, when we put hope on top of it, gives the parent even more inner space. Next slide. And so, wow, look at this, positive experiences. So this is Bob Sege's work. Positive experiences with the greatest predictive factor for those who had 4 or more ACEs included feeling your family stood by you in hard times and having someone to talk with about difficult feelings. So you can see that's the work that we do on a day-to-day basis in our early childhood mental health work. Next slide, please. And so our final slide is kind of how I sum up the work that we've done with Healthy Development Services. We use our ACEs to treat the ACEs. So we have an approach. It's relationship-based, it's parent-centered, it builds on family strengths, and it helps them develop skills. We focus on the parent-child interaction, and we promote nurture. We provide coordination. One of the things that we noticed when our systems were coordinated, our family and care coordinators, our case managers, started talking about how they knew the families, because they weren't worried about getting the families to the door. They were actually worried about getting the families through the services. We saw a real change in the way that they work. So that coordination is so important. And then E is excellence in service delivery. If you could have the best system in the world, but if you don't have great clinicians and great case managers and care coordinators, your services only go so far. And then the other part that I think is so important is providing supports. And normally I would put supports for parents first, but the truth of the matter is, if we can't support all of you as providers, then how can you support families? And I think this is something that we have to collectively advocate for, because we know that we can make a change in families' lives if we can support them. But to support families, we need to support our providers and our care deliverers. There's a parallel process. And I think we have this emphasis on productivity when we really need to be having an emphasis on changing relationships and changing families through these relationships. And of course, that takes time. I believe that's my last slide. And Jeff, I can't believe it. I made it through and we got time for questions.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Gidwani. That was great. I really loved how you wove things back. So you took social-emotional things and you wove them back into the anatomical and physiological. So it's really terrific. So we're open for questions. So I'm going to look at
The chat blowing up. People are tired.
So I'm still not seeing questions.
Do you have any?
I do many. So
Was there anything new in that?
say again.
Was there anything new that you've learned?
Well, I liked how you pulled you pulled our early morning speakers into this lecture as well. I like how you pulled the experience with home visiting into it as well. And I think you're being a bit of a hippie radical, which I love, when you talk about supporting providers, supporting families to support children. So I think that's wonderful. And you and I talk about this kind of stuff all the time. So I think that's very reasonable and rational. I don't know if everybody else thought it was reasonable and rational, because you really don't have questions. I think everybody understands it. We do have one question from Alyssa, who says, how do we encourage our organization to support our own staff and providers? I think you always get that kind of question at this point.
Yeah, no, and again, I think it's a wonderful question. I think what we have to start doing is I think we need to stand up with a voice. And Jeff was joking about me being a hippie radical, and that's not a hippie radical. I just am a pragmatist, and I believe we've got to stop buying the lie that you can do this for the cheap, on the cheap. I think it's really important for us to start talking about and building a model that really shows what does it take to make this work correctly. Jeff and I had a conversation about 2 years ago about the idea that we talk about, oh, let's do this with interns. Let's do it with essentially cheaper providers. Now, there are times where I would like Jeff or Ruth Newton to take care of the family because I want somebody who has that clinical experience. And even with someone as experienced as Jeff, I want to make sure Jeff gets reflective practice because, look, this work that we do, it takes a strain. So I think we need to start elaborating on a model that shows what it really takes to do this work and stop trying to do it on the cheap and stop using the things of productivity in the way that productivity is used in industry around building a car. We're not building cars. And I think we need to start talking about the fact of what does it really cost to do this? And really start pushing at a societal level. Now, I know I can be frustrating sometimes because I talk in these big ideas. And so I think what we have to do is go back to our organizations and ask them to see what they're willing to do to make things happen. And we're going to have to start in small ways. So I think it's a combination of crazy people like myself trying to make the systems change, but people like yourself who are practical to work upwards and say, these are the things that we think are reasonable for our staff. We think it is reasonable for all of our staff to get group reflective supervision. Okay, that's important. I personally am now talking about the fact that I don't think that you can do mental health work without a case coordinator, case manager. What I found is that with our professionals, who are exceptional professionals, when they're not the only person holding the family in mind, if there's two people holding the family in mind, there's less stress and there's less burnout. So again, it's cheaper to use, and again, I use that word very intentionally, use interns to do work, but then we burn them out and we're not training them appropriately. So I think we need to re-envision our entire system, and we need to say there's two things that are really important. Adequate training, supervision, and support for staff, and families need case managers, care coordinators when they have a certain level of need. And I think we need to start saying this is a societal piece and really talking about what does it cost? Because if we spend less money on it and we don't do it right, the costs in the long term are actually bigger. So we need to make that case. In the meantime, what I would suggest is going to your organization and asking what can they provide, and help them understand that the burnout and the turnover in the long run is what costs them. It's the same thing about trauma and addressing trauma. If we don't address it early, it's going to come up later on. Families aren't going to get the services. Families aren't going to get the medical care. Just trying to slow me down.
No, we have 128 people, 127 people in the room with us right now. Well, I was wondering if any of them had experience where their organization or their clinical situation supports this kind of relationship building, attunement with families, support, developing of hope, supporting hope, and sticking with the family. Can anybody say that they work in that kind of a situation now? Okay, let me ask the question differently. Does anybody work in a situation in which it's more of an apprenticeship situation, where the experienced people lead the less experienced people and try to show them how to develop?
There's a kid start.
You learn from the master, so to speak, so that you can see how to develop a relationship. And you know, oops, now I'm in a good relationship with this family. Now I can move on to safety and security. Now I can move on to a shared hypothesis about the child situation. So I do have a couple people who said that YMCA behavioral health services were all about relationships, so that's good. Marilee Burgesson says DIR profectum is that. Laura Salas says that parallel process supervision. I added supervision, Laura. Parallel process supervision can help that as well. If you have a great supervisor, that's great. Alyssa Duggan, you've raised your hand. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, I had too long to type in. I was going to say we did some success in my organization recently on the supervision end, because we went from occasional spotty supervision to consistently at least once a week to consistently twice a week, where we had a group and an individual all being provided by the organization. And unfortunately, it cost us multiple staff to get there. But I think that it just shows a huge difference. Now hoping to try and get one that's actually going to be on site, because right now we don't have a clinical supervisor on site. But then I think once we gain that, I think it's going to make a big difference in our ability to retain our clinical staff, because the turnover rate was so high that's at least part of the puzzle. And the other half, I think, is really going to be getting the other half of the staff, like the case management support and whatnot, to be consistent and to work more as a team. Whereas right now it's still kind of in survival mode, you know, like whoever's, especially with COVID, actually, because we're a residential facility where I'm at. And So we lose people every couple of weeks to possible COVID. And so it super disrupts the ability to have any kind of team that's consistently caring for our women and their families. So I'll be interested to see, we have had some management turnover and some kind of new vision come in. So I'm excited and interested to see long-term if it really does follow through, because I super agree with your, what you guys were saying about the ability to maintain that team and not have that burnout. You really need both.
Yeah, and Alyssa, the other thing I would really kind of have you consider looking at is when we talk about supervision, I think we need to be really, really clear about supervision, that you need clinical supervision, you need reflective supervision, and administrative supervision, and that you need all of it, right? And I think that's the important part, is you're helping the management understand what are the needs that reduce the turnover. So that's one piece. The other piece that's really practical is in this time of COVID, when I did my medical training, we would, go in, we would be on for, overnight, and then you'd have to sign out and you have to sign patients out. So in this time period where you can't maintain the teams by person to person, is thinking about what information is critical that gets passed on that helps maintain the relationship. So the relationship shifts from the relationship as you as an individual therapist to the organization caring for individuals. So what are those critical elements? So thank you for sharing that. And again, if your management and others need conversations, Jeff and I are always willing to talk to people and share what we've learned about the importance of supervision and support for staff.
Excellent. A couple of other programs wanted to brag. Flavia said that the Infant Project at Family Health Center San Diego, NCAR,
Yeah.
program. That's an example of a parallel practice supported kind of a program. Head Start, Early Head Start, Brenda says does that. Meyer says that Rush University Medical Center, Rush Neurobehavioral Center in Chicago does it. We're strength-based and very supportive of our families.
Excellent.
Oh, a couple have done it. Zade thinks that HDS is very helpful. You're part of that, Pradeep.
I would hope so.
Right, so that's all great. I do want to remind everybody to please go to the conference program and do the evaluation. If you are getting CEs and CMEs, you'll have to do a different process. But if you don't need those things, we still want your opinion. We still want to gather it. It really does shape next year's program. So on the conference program, I believe it was page 2, there's an evaluation link, so please go to that. Let me ask you to join me in thanking Dr. Gidwani for this wonderful talk. He took quite a broad topic and brought it into a very humanistic way. So click your reaction button so you can give him applause. Yay!
I miss seeing all of you in person.
So thank you very much. And this ends today's program. Tomorrow's program, I think, will start at 8 o'clock in the morning again. I know we're taskmasters, but we like to get all the stuff in before you get tired out. So thank you very much for attending. Thank you, Dr. Gidwani. Thanks to the audience, and we'll see you tomorrow.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Ah.